At 6:47 a.m. on November 3, 1944, Corporal Daniel Archer lay in frozen mud 400 yards from a German machine gun nest in the Hürtgen Forest, watching his standard-issue M73B1 telescopic sight fog over for the third time in 20 minutes. 26 years old, former tool and die maker from Pittsburgh, 11 weeks as a designated marksman. The machine gun had killed 4 Americans in the past hour. Archer had the shot. Perfect angle, wind at 3 miles per hour from the left, target stationary. But he couldn't see through the scope. The reticle was invisible behind condensation. Just a gray blur where a German machine gunner should have been. Archer wiped the objective lens with his sleeve. Didn't help. The moisture was inside, between the internal lenses where he couldn't reach it. He breathed slowly, tried to wait for the condensation to clear. It didn't. The temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy mist rolling through the forest. Exactly the conditions that killed American scopes and let German ones work perfectly. The machine gun fired again. MG-42, cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. Archer heard men screaming, heard the platoon sergeant yelling for a medic, heard the distinctive sound of American boots running through mud, trying to find cover. 2 more men down, maybe 3. All because Archer couldn't see through a scope the Army swore was combat ready. He pressed his eye to the fogged optic one more time. Still nothing. Just condensation and the shadow of a target he should have been able to identify clearly. The German machine gunner was right there, 420 yards, stationary, perfect kill shot. But Archer was aiming blind, guessing at a target he couldn't see. He made the decision. Crawled backward through the mud, slow and deliberate. The frozen ground soaked through his uniform, smelled like diesel smoke and rotting leaves, and something worse he didn't want to identify. Behind him, the medics were working. He could hear them talking, low and urgent. Could hear someone crying. Could hear the machine gun firing again. Archer reached the platoon's position at 0700 hours, watched the medics load 2 men onto stretchers. Both hit in the chest. Both probably going to die. He'd had the shot, had the angle, had the range, had everything except a scope that worked. That night, he did something that violated every supply regulation in the U.S. Army manual. The M73B1 was Army standard. 2.5 times magnification, 7.2 degree field of view, issued to 1 marksman per platoon. The problem wasn't accuracy. The scope could put rounds on target at 500 yards in perfect conditions. The problem was durability. Perfect conditions didn't exist in the Hürtgen Forest. The scope's internal lenses fogged in cold, wet weather. The nitrogen seal failed when subjected to sustained fire and temperature fluctuations. The mounting system loosened after 200 rounds, shifting point of impact by as much as 6 inches at 300 yards. And the seal failure rate wasn't occasional. It was epidemic. 40% of field-deployed M73B1s had failed nitrogen seals by November 1944. 40% of scopes showing internal condensation, unusable in morning fog or rain. The Army had exactly 1,200 scopes for 16,000 designated marksmen across the European theater. Supply couldn't keep up with demand, couldn't keep up with failure rates. Marksmen waited weeks for replacement scopes. Some never got them. They just aimed with iron sights and hoped. German snipers didn't have that problem. They had Zeiss scopes, 4 times magnification, superior optical glass, perfect nitrogen seals. German scopes worked in fog, worked in rain, worked in the exact conditions that killed American optics. The equipment disparity wasn't subtle. It was life and death. By November 1944, the 28th Infantry Division had lost 34 marksmen in the Hürtgen Forest. Not killed by superior German marksmanship, killed by inferior American equipment. They couldn't see their targets. German snipers could see them just fine. Archer had been issued his M73B1 on September 12, 1944, 11 weeks ago. The scope worked perfectly for 16 days. Clear glass, solid mounting, accurate to 500 yards. Then on September 28th, the nitrogen seal failed. He first noticed it during morning patrol. Slight haze inside the scope. Not bad enough to prevent shooting, but visible. Progressive. By October 15th, the scope fogged every cold morning. Took 30 minutes to clear after dawn, 30 minutes when German snipers owned the forest. By November 3rd, he was aiming through condensation, guessing at targets he should have been able to identify clearly. The scope was useless in anything except perfect visibility. Supply said they'd get him a replacement. Said it 3 times. September 30th, October 8th, October 22nd. No replacement ever came. Supply didn't have scopes, didn't have parts to fix broken ones, just had waiting lists and apologies. The first marksman Archer lost to equipment failure was Corporal James Whitley, September 28, 1944. Wisconsin farm boy, 22 years old, deer hunter since he was 12. Whitley had joined the platoon in August. Quiet kid, good with a rifle, patient. He'd made 3 confirmed kills in his first 2 weeks. On September 28th, Whitley was covering a patrol route at 0600 hours. Cold morning, heavy fog. His scope fogged completely. He couldn't see through it, couldn't clear it, couldn't make the shots he needed to make. German patrol came through at 0615, 8 soldiers, moving cautiously through the trees. Whitley tried to engage at 200 yards, fired 3 rounds through a scope he couldn't see through. All missed. German sniper didn't miss. 1 shot, center mass. Whitley died before the medics reached him. His M73B1 was still fogged when they recovered his body. The after-action report called it equipment failure, but nothing changed. Supplies still didn't have replacement scopes. The second marksman was Private First Class Robert Chen. October 12, 1944. San Francisco, engineering student at Berkeley before the war. 20 years old, wireframe glasses, talked about going back to finish his degree. Chen understood optics, understood precision. He'd noticed his scope mounting system was loose. Mentioned it to the platoon sergeant 3 times. Sergeant said to tighten it himself. Chen tried. The mounting rings were worn, threads stripped. Tightening didn't help. On October 12th, Chen engaged German soldiers at 350 yards. His scope's point of impact had shifted 8 inches low and 4 inches right from when he'd zeroed it. He didn't know that until he fired. First round missed. He tried to adjust, tried to compensate. German sniper was watching. German scope didn't have a loose mounting system. German scope put rounds exactly where the reticle showed. Chen took 3 rounds before he could get to cover. Died in the aid station 2 hours later. The worst was Sergeant Eddie Morrison. October 29, 1944. Archer's section leader. 31 years old, Michigan, married with 2 kids. Morrison was the best marksman in the platoon. 14 confirmed kills since August. Calm under pressure. Taught half the marksmen their trade. Morrison's scope nitrogen seal failed completely on October 15th. Total internal condensation. He couldn't see through it at all. Morrison complained to supply on October 16th. They said they'd get him a replacement. October 18th, still no scope. October 21st, still waiting. October 25th, supply said they had no scopes available, no estimated delivery date. Morrison kept using the failed scope anyway. Tried to shoot through the condensation, tried to make it work. Couldn't. On October 29th, German counterattack hit their position at 0700 hours. Morrison was in his usual spot, covering the approach. 4 German soldiers moving through the trees at 250 yards. Morrison fired 6 rounds. Couldn't see his targets, couldn't confirm hits. Germans spotted his muzzle flash. 3 of them had rifles. 1 had a Zeiss scope. German sniper put 2 rounds through Morrison's position. Both hit. Morrison died trying to make shots with a scope that didn't work. Died because supply couldn't get him equipment that functioned. His brother Steve was in the same platoon. Steve found his body, found the scope still mounted on his rifle, still fogged, still useless. That was when Archer decided regulations didn't matter anymore, Daniel. Archer grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked at Westinghouse, precision machining department. Made parts for electrical generators, turbines, transformers. Work that required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Archer learned the trade young. Could read blueprints at age 12. Could cut threads with a hand file by 14. Could hold tolerances to .005 inches by 16. Tool and die making was art and mathematics. You looked at a part, understood what it needed to do, figured out how to make it. Sometimes you followed drawings, sometimes you improvised. The best tool makers could build anything with basic equipment. File, drill press, lathe, patience. Archer was good at it, not because he was naturally talented, because he practiced. Because his father made him redo work that wasn't perfect. Because precision mattered. When Pearl Harbor happened, Archer was 23 years old, working at Westinghouse, engaged to a girl named Helen Richardson. He enlisted January 1943. Army wanted him for maintenance, for keeping equipment running. He asked for infantry, wanted to fight, not fix. They sent him to basic training at Fort Benning, then to Europe in August 1944. Archer qualified as a marksman in June 1944. He could shoot. Not exceptional, not outstanding, just competent. Scored 207 out of 250 on the qualification course. But what made him valuable wasn't accuracy. It was patience. Marksman work required waiting. Required understanding wind, distance, timing. Required mechanical sympathy for the rifle and scope system. Most soldiers saw a rifle as a tool. Archer saw it as a machine with tolerance stacks and failure points. He'd been issued his M73B1 on September 12th. Understood immediately it was poorly designed. The nitrogen seal was inadequate. The mounting system was weak. The internal lens spacing created condensation points. He knew these things because he understood mechanical systems, understood how moisture got into sealed assemblies, understood why the scope failed. By November 3rd, 1944, Archer had watched 3 men die because of scope failures. Whitley, Chen, Morrison. 3 marksmen who couldn't see their targets. 3 funerals. 3 letters home to families. And supplies still didn't have replacement scopes. That night, November 3rd, 2100 hours, Archer sat alone in the platoon supply tent. On the table in front of him, his failed M73B1 scope, a pair of German Zeiss binoculars from a dead officer, a busted periscope assembly from a destroyed Sherman tank, brass fittings from artillery shell casings, a hand file, drill bits, grease, and rubber gaskets. He was going to build something better, something that worked, something that didn't fog in cold weather or fail after 6 weeks. He didn't have authorization, didn't have official approval, didn't care. Morrison was dead because Army procurement couldn't deliver functional equipment. Archer wasn't going to be next. He picked up the file and started cutting threads into a piece of brass. The metal resisted, fought back. He kept filing. Outside, he could hear distant artillery, could hear diesel generators running, could smell the forest and the mud and the war. If supply couldn't give him a scope that worked, he'd build one himself. At 2100 hours on November 3, 1944, Archer worked alone in the platoon supply tent. The space was cramped, smelled like canvas and gun oil and damp wool. A single electric bulb hung from the center pole, throwing harsh shadows across the wooden table. Most of the platoon had gone to sleep. The only sounds were distant generators and the occasional crack of artillery miles away. Archer laid out his materials, failed M73B1 scope from his own rifle. German Zeiss binoculars recovered from a dead officer on October 18th. Busted Sherman tank periscope salvaged from a destroyed M4A3 2 days ago. Brass fittings cut from artillery shell casings. Hand file, drill bits, small lathe liberated from a machine shop in a destroyed village. Grease, rubber gaskets from a truck repair kit. He started with the M73B1, disassembled it carefully. The internal mechanism came apart in 12 pieces. He kept the reticle assembly. It was good, precise crosshairs etched into glass. Everything else went in a pile for scrap. The nitrogen seal system was the problem. Complicated, fragile, designed for factory conditions, not battlefield use. He wasn't going to replicate it. The German binoculars were better equipment than anything American supply issued. Zeiss optics, 4x magnification, crystal clear glass. Archer disassembled them slowly. The lenses were pristine. He extracted 2, both perfectly matched, both designed to work together. These would give him the magnification advantage German snipers had. The tank periscope housing was the key. Sherman tank periscopes were built to survive battlefield conditions, sealed against weather, resistant to temperature change, designed to function in mud and rain and snow. The housing was solid steel, 8.7 inches long, 1.6 inches in diameter. Archer cut it down to 8.5 inches with a hacksaw. Took 40 minutes. The steel was hardened, fought the blade. His hands were numb from cold and vibration by the time he finished. Now came the precision work. The binocular lenses needed to mount inside the periscope housing at exactly the right spacing. Too close and the focal length would be wrong. Too far and the image would blur. Archer measured with calipers. 3.2 inches between the objective lens and the eyepiece. He checked the measurement twice. Precision mattered. He needed mounting rings to hold the lenses at the correct spacing. The brass shell casings provided material. He cut segments from 75mm brass, heated them with a torch until they glowed red, shaped them on a mandrel. The brass was soft when hot, hard when cool. He worked it carefully, formed 2 rings that would fit inside the periscope housing and hold the lenses secure. Threading the rings took longest. He had to cut threads by hand with a file. The thread pitch had to match perfectly, or the rings wouldn't seat properly. Archer worked slowly. Cut a groove, checked the fit, cut deeper. His hands slipped twice. The file was cold. His fingers were numb. On the second slip, the file cut his thumb. Blood made the brass slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls, kept working. 43 minutes to get the threads right. The rings screwed into the periscope housing smoothly. He installed the German lenses using brass spacers he'd machined to hold them at precisely 3.2 inches separation. The eyepiece lens went in first, then the objective lens. Both seated perfectly. The reticle assembly from the M73B1 mounted between the lenses. Archer had to modify the mounting brackets, file them down to fit the narrower housing. Another 20 minutes of work. When he finished, the reticle was centered, visible, perfect. The sealing system was crude but effective. No nitrogen fill, no complicated valves, just grease-packed rubber gaskets at both ends of the periscope housing. Tank periscopes used the same principle. The housing itself prevented condensation by maintaining thermal mass. Steel didn't temperature shift as fast as aluminum. Slower temperature change meant less internal condensation. Mounting the assembly to his rifle required adapting the M73B1 scope rings. He filed the rings to fit the periscope housing diameter. The fit was tight, required force to seat properly. He drilled and tapped new mounting holes, used screws salvaged from a destroyed machine gun mount. When he tightened everything down, the assembly was solid. No movement, no flex. Total time, 6 hours, 15 minutes. He finished at 03:17 on November 4th. His hands were cut in 3 places. His fingers ached from cold and repetitive motion. His back hurt from hunching over the work table. But when he looked through the scope, the image was perfect. Clear glass, sharp reticle, 4 times magnification. The wider field of view made target acquisition faster. The periscope housing felt solid, professional. The assembly weighed 14 ounces. Standard M73B1 weighed 5 ounces. 9-ounce penalty. But weight didn't matter if the scope actually worked. Archer stepped outside the tent at 03:20. The forest was dark, quiet except for distant generators. Cold air hit his face, sharp and clean. He looked through the scope at a tree 200 yards away. Could see the bark texture clearly. No condensation, no fog. The periscope housing maintained clarity despite the temperature difference between tent and outside air. He went to his bunk. Didn't sleep. Lay on his back watching the tent ceiling until dawn. Outside, the war continued. Artillery rumbled somewhere to the east. A truck convoy rolled past heading south. At 0600 hours, he got up, cleaned his rifle, checked the scope mounting one more time. At 0630, he walked to morning formation with the homemade scope mounted on his M1903 Springfield. The other marksmen saw it immediately. The scope looked wrong. Too long, too thick, obviously not standard issue. The periscope housing was dull steel, industrial, ugly compared to the sleek aluminum of factory scopes. The mounting system was cobbled together from mismatched parts. The whole assembly looked like something built in a garage. Corporal Steve Morrison stared at it. "What the hell is that?" "Scope," Archer said. "That's not a scope. That's a piece of pipe with glass on the ends." Private First Class. Tommy Price laughed. "Looks like you built it in your garage, Archer." "Built it in the supply tent." "Does it even work?" Price asked. "I'll find out." Sergeant Frank Riley pushed through the group of marksmen. Looked at Archer's rifle, looked at the scope, frowned. "That's not regulation, Archer." "Standard scope doesn't work," Archer said. "This one does." "You don't know that." "I know the M73B1 fogs every morning. I know Morrison died because his scope didn't work. I know supply doesn't have replacements." Riley's expression hardened. Morrison had been his friend. "You can't just build your own equipment. There are regulations, liability concerns. If that thing fails during combat, then I die. Same as Morrison, same as Chen, same as Whitley." "That's not the point." "What is the point, Sergeant?" Riley didn't answer immediately. He examined the scope more closely. The crude threading, the mismatched brass fittings, the tank periscope housing. "The point is chain of command. Army issues equipment. Soldiers use it. We don't build our own." Army-issued equipment doesn't work. That's not your decision to make. Platoon Sergeant Marcus Webb walked over, 41 years old, regular Army since 1928. He looked at Archer, looked at the scope, looked at Riley. "What's the problem?" Riley pointed at the scope. Archer built his own scope. Unauthorized modification. Regulations say, "I know what regulations say." Webb turned to Archer. "Why?" "Because supply doesn't have scopes. Because mine fogs every morning. Because I had the shot yesterday and couldn't take it because I couldn't see through condensation." Webb examined the scope. Didn't touch it. Just looked. "Does it work?" "Don't know yet." "You built it without testing it?" "Tested it this morning. Clear image, no fog. Don't know how it performs in combat." "Where'd you get the parts?" "German binoculars, tank periscope, brass fittings, all salvage." Webb studied Archer for a long moment. Then he looked at the other. "Marksman. 7 men, all watching, all waiting to see what happened. Any of you have working scopes?" 2 raised their hands. 5 didn't. 5 marksmen with fogged or broken M73 B1s, waiting for supply to deliver replacements that never came. Webb looked back at Archer. "You're going out today?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Then I guess you'll find out if your garage project works." He turned to Riley. "If it works, we'll deal with regulations later. If it doesn't work, Archer gets himself killed and the problem solves itself." Riley started to protest. Webb cut him off. "We've lost 3 marksmen to equipment failure. I'm not losing another one because supply can't deliver. If Archer built something that works, I don't care if he used scrap metal and hope. Understood?" Riley nodded. Didn't look happy about it. The other marksmen were silent. Some looked skeptical, some looked curious. Price was still smirking, thought the whole thing was funny. Morrison wasn't smirking. Morrison was staring at the scope like he was trying to figure out if Archer was crazy or genius. Webb dismissed the formation. Archer checked his rifle one more time, loaded 5 rounds into the internal magazine, chambered one. The scope mounted solid, no movement. He walked to his assigned position thinking about what would happen if the scope failed. If the lenses were misaligned. If the housing let moisture in. If the mounting system came loose during recoil. If any of that happened, he'd be dead before he figured it out. At 08:15, Archer was in his forward observation position, 380 yards from German trench lines. Cold morning, temperature 34 degrees, heavy mist rolling through the forest. Exactly the conditions that killed standard M73 B1 scopes. He looked through his homemade scope. Crystal clear. No fog, no condensation. The periscope housing was working exactly as designed. Behind him, he could hear other marksmen setting up. Price was 50 yards to his left. Morrison was 30 yards to his right. Both had standard scopes. Archer could hear them cursing quietly, wiping lenses, trying to see through condensation. Their scopes were fogging. His wasn't. At 08:47, Archer acquired his first target. German observer, 420 yards, standing in a trench watching American lines through binoculars. The homemade scope's 4 times magnification showed details impossible with standard equipment. Archer could see the man's face, could see his helmet strap, his collar insignia, the way he held the binoculars. Wind was 5 miles per hour, right to left. Archer adjusted his aim, held 2 clicks right for windage. The German was stationary, focused on his own observation, unaware he was being watched. Archer controlled his breathing. Slow inhale, partial exhale, hold. Squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled. The scope stayed perfectly aligned. Through the optic, Archer watched the German drop, clean, hit, center mass. The man fell backward into the trench, binoculars falling from his hands. Archer cycled the bolt, chambered another round, scanned for reaction. German soldiers in the trench were moving, responding to the shot, but they didn't know where it came from. 420 yards was outside their normal threat range. American marksmen with standard scopes couldn't make that shot reliably in these conditions. This German probably thought he was safe. He'd been wrong. At 09:12, the machine gun from yesterday started firing again. Same MG-42 that had killed 4 Americans. Same position. The gunner was repositioning his weapon, adjusting the tripod. 410 yards. Archer could see him clearly through the homemade scope. Could see his hands on the weapon. Could see him checking the belt feed. Archer adjusted for range and wind, held steady, fired. The machine gunner fell. The MG-42 went silent. German soldiers scrambled to the gun position, tried to get the weapon operational again. But the gunner was dead, and the gun sat unmanned. 2 targets, 2 kills. Both shots impossible with fogged standard equipment. At 10:03, Archer found target number 3. German sniper, 385 yards, well concealed in a destroyed building. The sniper was firing at American positions, had already hit 1 soldier. Archer could see the Zeiss scope glint, could see the rifle barrel. Partial target, difficult shot. But the homemade scope's magnification and clarity made it possible. He waited. Counter-sniper work required patience. The German would move eventually. Everyone moved eventually. Archer watched through his scope, breathing slowly, waiting. 3 minutes. The German shifted position, adjusting his aim for a new target. His shoulder and head became visible for maybe 2 seconds. Archer fired during that window. Through the scope, he saw the impact. The German's rifle fell. The man slumped. Confirmed kill. 3 targets in 90 minutes. 3 confirmed kills. Archer's homemade scope hadn't fogged once, hadn't lost 0, hadn't failed in any way. He cycled his rifle, scanned for more targets, found 2 more before 1100 hours, both at ranges beyond 400 yards. Both clean kills. By 1100 hours, when Archer returned to the platoon position, he had 5 confirmed kills. The other marksmen had 0. Their standard scopes had fogged at dawn. Still weren't clear. Price and Morrison hadn't fired a single shot. Couldn't see their targets. Word spread fast. By 11:30, every marksman in the company knew Archer's homemade scope worked. Knew it outperformed standard equipment. The mockery from morning formation was gone. Now they were asking questions. Morrison found Archer at noon. Your scope, it really doesn't fog? No. And it stayed zeroed? No shift after 5 rounds? No shift. How? Archer explained the periscope housing, the thermal mass, the grease-packed gaskets. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Archer finished, Morrison asked the question Archer had been expecting. Can you build me one? Between November 5th and November 8th, 1944, Archer built 3 more scopes. Corporal Steve Morrison requested the first one. Morrison wanted to kill Germans with equipment that actually worked. Wanted revenge for his brother Eddie, who died with a fogged scope on October 29th. Archer said yes. Building the second scope went faster than the first. Archer knew the process now, knew which measurements mattered, which tolerances he could relax, which parts required precision. He found another pair of German binoculars from a dead officer recovered November 4th. Found another tank periscope from a destroyed Sherman near the company command post. The brass came from 75mm shell casings, same as before. Morrison watched him work, watched him cut threads, file brass, measure lens spacing with calipers. Morrison asked questions. How much spacing between lenses? 3.2 inches. Why that distance? Because that's what the German binocular optical system required for proper focus. How tight should the mounting rings be? Tight enough that recoil won't shift them. Loose enough that thermal expansion won't crack the lenses. The scope took 4 hours, 32 minutes to build. Faster than the first one because Archer didn't make mistakes. Didn't have to redo threading. Didn't cut his hands. Morrison mounted it on his M1903 that night. Test fired it the next morning. 5 rounds at 200 yards. All 5 hit within a 2-inch circle. 0 shift between shots. No fogging despite cold morning air. Morrison got his first kill with a homemade scope at 0740 on November 6th. German machine gunner, 390 yards. 1 shot, clean kill. Morrison came back grinning. Said it was the clearest sight picture he'd ever had. Said he could see the machine gunner's face, could count the buttons on his uniform. Private First Class Danny Wright requested a scope on November 6th. 19 years old, Mississippi, farmer before the war. Wright had been using a standard M73B1 with a failed nitrogen seal for 3 weeks. Supply kept promising a replacement. Supply kept not delivering. Wright watched Morrison make a kill at 390 yards and decided he wanted what Morrison had. Corporal John Kowalski requested one on November 7th. Chicago. Former machinist at a steel plant. Kowalski understood precision work, understood what Archer was doing. He didn't just want a scope. He wanted to learn how to build them. Archer taught him, showed him how to cut threads, how to measure lens spacing, how to seal the periscope housing with grease-packed gaskets. By November 8th, 4 homemade scopes were operational in the platoon. Archer's, Morrison's, Wright's, Kowalski's. By November 12th, Kowalski had built 3 more scopes for marksmen in other platoons. Word was spreading. Marksmen from other companies were asking how to get the scopes, how to build them, where to find parts. The parts weren't the limiting factor. German binoculars were everywhere. Dead officers carried them routinely. Tank periscope housings came from destroyed Shermans, and the Hürtgen Forest had plenty of those. Brass shell casings were unlimited. Any artillery position had hundreds. The limiting factor was time and skill. Building a scope took 4 to 5 hours if you knew what you were doing. Took 8 to 10 hours if you were learning. Not every soldier could cut threads by hand or measure optical spacing with calipers. But Kowalski could. And Kowalski taught 2 other soldiers who had machining experience. By November 18th, 11 homemade scopes were operational across the battalion. 11 marksmen with equipment that worked in conditions where standard scopes failed. The combat results were impossible to ignore. Between November 4th and November 18th, marksmen with homemade scopes killed 89 German soldiers. Marksmen with standard M73B1s killed 12. 11 soldiers versus 23 soldiers. 89 kills versus 12 kills. The average was brutal. 8.1 kills per marksman for homemade scope users. 0.5 kills per marksman for standard scope users. The homemade scopes worked in fog, worked in rain, worked in cold. Never fogged, never lost 0, never failed. Standard scopes fogged every cold morning, lost 0 after sustained fire, failed at rates approaching 50% by mid-November. On November 14th, the Germans launched a counterattack at dawn. 200-plus soldiers, full company strength, hitting American positions along a half-mile front. 6 marksmen with homemade scopes were on the line. The attack came at 06:20, exactly when morning fog was heaviest. The marksmen could see clearly. Standard scopes were fogged. Homemade scopes weren't. Archer targeted a German officer at 410 yards. Could see the officer directing soldiers, pointing toward American positions. Archer fired. The officer fell. German attack lost coordination for maybe 30 seconds, while a sergeant tried to figure out what happened. Morrison took a machine gunner at 380 yards. Wright took another officer at 440 yards. Kowalski took a soldier carrying ammunition. Secondary explosions when the ammunition cooked off. In the first 20 minutes, 6 marksmen made 17 confirmed kills, all high-value targets. Officers, NCOs, machine gunners, communication runners. The German attack stalled. Lost momentum. Companies need leadership to coordinate assault. Marksmen had killed the leadership. By 0700, the Germans were retreating. American casualties were light. German casualties were heavy. After-action reports credited the marksmen with breaking the attack. Standard M73B1 users made 2 kills total that morning, both after 0800, when the fog cleared and their scopes finally worked. Company Commander Captain James Whitmore noticed. He wasn't stupid. He could read after-action reports, could see which marksmen were effective and which weren't, could see that 11 soldiers with homemade scopes were outperforming 23 soldiers with Army-issue equipment. On November 16th, Whitmore called Archer to the company command post, asked him to explain the scope. Archer showed him one, explained the design, explained why periscope housing prevented condensation while M73B1 seals failed. Whitmore listened, examined the scope, asked good questions about durability and accuracy. Then he asked the question Archer had been dreading. Is this authorized equipment? No, sir. Does supply know you're building these? No, sir. Battalion know? Don't think so, sir. Whitmore set the scope down carefully. You understand this violates regulations. Unauthorized modifications to weapon systems. Use of non-standard equipment. If something goes wrong, if one of these scopes fails and gets someone killed, it's on you. Yes, sir. But if we stop using them, men die because standard scopes don't work. Whitmore rubbed his face, looked tired. Between bad regulations and dead soldiers, I'll take bad regulations. Keep building them. But if Battalion asks, you didn't get permission from me. Understood, sir. Archer left thinking the problem was solved. He was wrong. On November 19th, Battalion Supply Officer Captain Morris arrived at the company position. Morris was regular Army, West Point, 28 years old, career-focused. He'd heard about unauthorized scopes being used in the field, heard soldiers were building equipment from salvaged parts. That violated every supply regulation he'd ever learned. Morris found Archer at the firing line, confiscated his scope, examined it like it was evidence at a court-martial. This is not Army-issue equipment. No, sir. You built this yourself? Yes, sir. Using salvaged parts from multiple sources, none of which were authorized for scope construction. Yes, sir. Morris held up the scope. This violates Army Regulation 350-6, unauthorized modifications to weapon systems. Violates supply protocols regarding non-standard equipment. Represents a liability concern if it fails during combat operations. You understand that? I understand you don't have replacement scopes, sir. I understand 3 men in this platoon died because their scopes didn't work. I understand supply has been promising replacements for 8 weeks and hasn't delivered one. That's not the point? What is the point, sir? Morris's face hardened. The point is, regulations exist for a reason. We can't have soldiers building their own equipment. Can't have unauthorized modifications. Can't have liability exposure when homemade equipment fails. Standard equipment fails 40% of the time. That's a supply chain issue, not your concern. It's my concern when I can't see my targets and Germans can see me. Morris set the scope down. I'm ordering all non-standard scopes confiscated. All soldiers using unauthorized equipment will return to Army-issue scopes or iron sights until proper equipment can be supplied. Supply doesn't have proper equipment. That's not the point. I know. Archer looked at Morris directly. Sir, with respect, you're going to get men killed enforcing regulations that don't work. That scope you're holding has 89 confirmed kills attached to it. 0 malfunctions. Standard scopes in this battalion have 17 kills and 34 dead marksmen. The math isn't complicated. Morrison had been listening 50 yards away. He walked over now. Captain, that scope saved my life 4 times. My brother died with a standard scope that didn't work. I'm not going back to equipment that fogs every morning. Kowalski joined them. Sir, I built 3 scopes myself. Taught 2 other soldiers how. We're keeping men alive with equipment that works. Morris looked at the 3 of them, looked at the scope. This isn't about whether they work. This is about chain of command, about following regulations, about covering your ass. Morrison's voice was flat. My brother's dead because supply couldn't deliver. You want more dead soldiers so your paperwork looks good? That's insubordination, Corporal. Court-martial me then. But I'm keeping my scope until you give me one that works better. Captain Whitmore arrived. He'd heard the confrontation from the command post. Captain Morris. Problem? Morris explained. Unauthorized equipment, regulation violations, liability concerns. Whitmore listened without expression. When Morris finished, Whitmore asked one question. Do you have 17 working M73B1 scopes to replace the homemade ones? That's not the issue. That's exactly the issue. You want to confiscate equipment that works. What do you give these marksmen instead? Standard procedure says they use iron sights until proper scopes. Iron sights are useless at 400 yards. These men are marksmen, not riflemen. They need scopes. Whitmore picked up Archer's scope. This scope works. Standard scopes don't. Until supply gives me working M73B1s, my marksmen keep the equipment they have. Is that clear? Morris stiffened. I'll be filing a formal complaint with Division. You do that. Until Division overrules me, these scopes stay in service. Morris left angry. Whitmore handed the scope back to Archer. You've got maybe a week before Division responds. Make it count. Archer nodded. Knew what was coming. New command would eventually force compliance with regulations. But for 1 week, his marksmen had equipment that worked. 1 week was better than nothing. What none of them knew was that German intelligence was already trying to figure out why American marksmen had suddenly become so much more effective. On November 20th, 1944, Obergefreiter Klaus Reinhardt filed a report with German 275th Infantry Division intelligence. Reinhardt was a sniper. 47 confirmed kills since 1941. He'd fought in Russia, France, now Germany. Knew his trade. Understood American tactics, understood their equipment limitations. His report said American marksmen had changed. They were more accurate in poor visibility, more effective at extended ranges, making kills at distances previously safe. Reinhardt couldn't explain it. American M1903 rifles hadn't changed. American training hadn't changed. But something was different. On November 21st, Reinhardt encountered Archer. 440-yard engagement lasting 35 minutes. Both snipers maneuvering, both trying to gain advantage. Heavy mist, visibility poor. Reinhardt's Zeiss scope showed movement but couldn't resolve clear targets. He could see shadows, shapes, nothing precise. Archer could see Reinhardt's position clearly, could see the rifle barrel, could see movement behind the sight. The homemade scope's 4 times magnification and weather-resistant housing gave him advantage Reinhardt didn't understand. Every time Reinhardt moved, Archer tracked him. Every time Reinhardt tried to acquire a sight picture, Archer was already aimed. Reinhardt retreated. First time in 8 months, he'd withdrawn from a sniper duel. He couldn't understand how the American could see him in conditions where his own superior Zeiss optics struggled. Filed another report that night. Americans have new equipment. Unknown optical system. Recommend investigation. German intelligence examined American casualties. Found standard M73B1s on most bodies. No pattern of new equipment. No evidence of different scopes. They concluded Americans must have received limited shipment of improved optics. Maybe 50 units, maybe fewer. Distributed to best marksmen. They were wrong. The improved optics were built from German salvage and American scrap. 11 scopes total by November 21st. 19 by November 28th. But German intelligence never figured that out. Between November 3rd and December 15th, 1944, the homemade scopes proved themselves in ways impossible to dispute. Archer's personal record was brutal. 67 confirmed kills in 43 days. 0 scope malfunctions. Average engagement range 390 yards. Longest shot 520 yards. German officer on December 8th. The officer was coordinating defensive positions. Archer killed him from over a quarter-mile away. The German unit lost coordination, withdrew in disorder. Morrison had 42 kills. Wright had 38. Kowalski had 34. The other 15 marksmen, using homemade scopes, averaged 26 kills each. Total, 141 confirmed German kills attributed to 19 homemade scopes. Marksmen using standard M73B1s averaged 3.1 kills in the same period. Some had 0. The equipment disparity was obvious. Homemade scopes worked. Standard scopes didn't. The casualty statistics were equally clear. Before November 4th, 34 marksmen had died in the 28th Infantry Division. Between November 4th and December 15th, 3 more died. None of the 3 were using homemade scopes. All 3 had standard M73B1s. 2 died because their scopes fogged during German attacks. 1 died when his scope mounting system failed mid-engagement, shifting his 0.8 inches at combat range. 0 marksmen using homemade scopes died. 19 soldiers, 43 days of combat, 0 killed. The scopes didn't make them invincible, but the scopes let them see clearly, shoot accurately, function effectively. That was enough. By December 15th, word had spread beyond the 28th Division. Marksmen from 4th Infantry Division were requesting builds. 8th Infantry Division marksmen were building their own versions, adapting Archer's design with local variations. One unit used aircraft gun sight glass instead of binocular lenses. Another used periscope housings from destroyed tank destroyers. The principle stayed the same: weather-resistant housing, salvaged optics, grease-packed seals. On December 18th, Army Ordnance Department sent a technical team. Captain Andrew Morrison, Optical Systems Engineer, West Point class of 1938. Morrison examined Archer's scope like it was a puzzle, disassembled it carefully, measured lens spacing, tested the periscope housing seal, fired it against standard M73B1 at ranges from 100 to 500 yards. His findings went into a formal report. The homemade scope had superior magnification. 4 times versus 2.5 times gave significant advantage in target identification. Field of view was wider than M73B1, despite higher magnification. Weather resistance was substantially better. The periscope housing's thermal mass prevented condensation where standard seals failed. Durability was adequate despite crude construction. Weight penalty was 9 ounces, acceptable trade-off for improved performance. The design violated manufacturing standards, but solved critical field problems standard equipment couldn't handle. Morrison's recommendation was careful. The design was field expedient, not suitable for mass production. But it demonstrated principles Army Ordnance should have incorporated in the original M73B1 specification. Recommend official study for post-war scope development. Recommend limited field authorization for existing homemade scopes pending supply delivery of adequate standard equipment. Division commander read the report, made a decision that satisfied nobody and angered everyone. Existing homemade scopes could remain in service. No new builds would be authorized. No official recognition, no supply support. The scopes existed in a regulatory gray zone. Not approved, not forbidden, not acknowledged. The war ended before it mattered. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. Archer survived. 209 days in combat, 67 confirmed kills, 0 wounds. His homemade scope never malfunctioned, not once in 6 months of daily use. Archer returned to Pittsburgh in July 1945. Brought the scope home, didn't mention it to anyone. Went back to Westinghouse, back to precision machining, back to making parts for electrical generators. The war was over. He'd survived. That was enough. He married Helen Richardson in September 1946. 3 children followed. Daniel Jr. in 1947, Robert in 1949, Margaret in 1952. Archer worked at Westinghouse for 37 years. Lived quietly. Didn't talk about the war. The scope stayed in his garage, mounted on a wooden rack next to his lathe and drill press, covered in oil-soaked cloth to prevent rust. His children saw it growing up, asked about it sometimes. Archer said he'd built it during the war. Said standard equipment didn't work, so he made something better. Never mentioned the 67 kills. Never mentioned November 4th when the other marksmen mocked him. Never mentioned that his design saved 16 men's lives. In 1967, his son Daniel Jr. asked about the scope. Wanted to know details. Archer showed him how to read micrometers, how to cut threads with a hand file, how to hold tolerances to thousandths of an inch. Told him sometimes you have to fix things yourself when the official solution doesn't work. Told him precision matters. Told him good enough usually isn't. Never mentioned he'd proven that lesson under fire in the Hürtgen Forest. Daniel Archer died March 14, 1998. Heart failure, Pittsburgh General Hospital. He was 79 years old. The obituary said retired Westinghouse machinist, World War II veteran. Mentioned he served with the 28th Infantry Division. Didn't mention 67 confirmed kills. Didn't mention the homemade scope. Didn't mention he'd changed how American marksmen fought. The funeral was small. 34 people. Family, former co-workers, neighbors. 3 old men. Nobody in the family recognized drove from Michigan, Illinois, Mississippi. Steve Morrison, John Kowalski, Danny Wright. Marksmen who'd survived the war using scopes Archer built or taught them to build. They told Archer's children what their father had done. Told them about November 4th when he showed up with a scope built from tank parts and German binoculars. Told them about the mockery, the validation, the 67 kills. Told them their fathers saved 16 marksmen's lives by building equipment that worked when Army supply couldn't deliver. Morrison said Archer was the best marksman he'd ever served with. Said Archer never bragged, never took credit, just did the work. Kowalski said Archer taught him to build scopes. Said he'd used his for 5 months straight, never fogged once. Wright said he was alive because of what Archer made. Simple as that. The scope went to the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Donated by Archer's estate. It's displayed in the World War II Small Arms section. The placard says, Field Expedient Telescopic Sight, Hürtgen Forest, 1944. Notes it was built by Corporal Daniel Archer from salvaged parts. Tank periscope housing, German binocular lenses, brass fittings. Doesn't mention 67 kills. Doesn't mention 43 days without malfunction. Doesn't mention 16 men who came home because one tool and die maker refused to accept equipment that didn't work. Most museum visitors walk past without stopping. Veterans stop. They look at the crude threading, the mismatched brass, the industrial periscope housing. They understand what they're seeing. Understand desperation turned into precision. Understand innovation born from necessity. Post-war scope development incorporated lessons nobody officially acknowledged. The M84 scope introduced in 1953 had improved weather sealing. Grease-packed gaskets, similar to Archer's design. Better thermal management. The M49 scope used in Korea had robust housing resistant to temperature shock. Modern military scopes use sealed construction principles field mechanics figured out in 1944. Nobody credited Archer. The improvements came from official engineering studies, official procurement channels, official validation testing. But the mechanics who'd built scopes from salvage knew where the ideas originated, knew which principles worked because they'd proven them under fire. 19 homemade scopes built in the 28th Infantry Division. 141 Germans killed by those scopes. 16 American marksmen survived who might not have. All because one corporal understood that precision work and good design mattered more than regulations. That's how wars are actually won. Not by superior equipment issued from supply depots. By soldiers who see problems and fix them with whatever they can find. By tool and die makers who know how to cut threads and pack grease and hold tolerances. By men who refuse to let their friends die because someone in an office designed equipment that fogs in cold weather. Archer never received a medal for the scope. Never received official recognition. Army ordnance reports sat in files for decades. But 16 men came home. 16 families got their sons and brothers and husbands back. That mattered more than medals. The mockery on November 4th didn't last. Pipe Dream became Pittsburgh Special became that scope that actually works. 2 weeks from ridicule to replication. 6 weeks from regulation violation to quietly encouraged field expedient. German snipers never understood why American marksmen suddenly could see through fog and rain. Never knew they were being killed by scopes built from their own binoculars. Never knew a machinist from Pennsylvania had turned their Zeiss lenses against them. Innovation doesn't come from procurement committees. Comes from corporals with hand files and patience. Comes from men who understand mechanical systems and battlefield reality. Comes from soldiers who refuse to watch their friends die, waiting for supply to deliver equipment that works. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like helps us share forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue these histories from archives every week. Real people, real courage, real innovation under impossible pressure. Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Texas to Berlin, veterans to students, you're keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if family served. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Daniel Archer doesn't disappear into silence.